Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
The autumn of 1894 brought with it an unusual restlessness to the streets of London. The persistent fog had settled over the city like a shroud, and with it came a series of peculiar incidents that would soon demand the attention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had returned to our old lodgings at 221B Baker Street some months earlier, having resumed my medical practice in the vicinity, and found my friend in one of his increasingly frequent periods of enforced idleness. It was approaching midnight on a particularly dreary Thursday when our doorbell rang with an urgency that suggested distress rather than mere social calling. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed up the stairs, followed by a hurried masculine tread that spoke of agitation barely contained. Holmes, who had been slouched in his armchair with his eyes half closed in what I had learned to recognize as intense contemplation rather than drowsiness, suddenly animated. His grey eyes sharpened, and he tilted his head with the peculiar bird-like attention he assumed when his interest was piqued. "A gentleman," he murmured, "recently returned from India, no more than 3 months. Military bearing, though no longer in active service. He comes regarding a matter of family disgrace rather than personal danger, yet he fears the consequences may prove fatal to someone close to him." I had barely time to register my amazement at this rapid deduction when Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, announcing, "Major Edmund Blackwood to see you." "Mr. Holmes." The man who entered our sitting room was indeed military in his carriage, though his face bore the weathered complexion of one long exposed to tropical sun. He was perhaps 45 years of age, with prematurely greying hair and eyes that darted nervously about our chambers before settling on Holmes with an expression of desperate hope. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I have come because Scotland Yard has proven useless, and I fear my sister's reputation, perhaps even her life, hangs in the balance." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own. "Pray be seated, Major Blackwood. You returned from Bangalore in July, if I am not mistaken, having served with the 41st Regiment. Your sister, whom you have not seen in approximately 4 years, now finds herself implicated in circumstances that baffle both yourself and the authorities. I perceive also that you walked here from Mayfair, declining a cab despite the inclement weather, which suggests you wish this visit to remain unobserved." Our visitor had gone quite pale. "Extraordinary. But how could you possibly—" "Elementary observations merely," Holmes interrupted with a dismissive wave. "The reddish dust on your right boot is characteristic of the Deccan Plateau, and your regimental pin, though you attempt to conceal it within your coat, is quite visible when you move. The Times this morning mentioned the return of several officers from the 41st, and your complexion suggests long exposure to Indian sun, though your skin shows the recent adjustment to our English climate. As for your sister, you mentioned her reputation first before any mention of crime or mystery, which indicates a family matter. The rest is simple deduction from your manner and the late hour of your arrival." Major Blackwood leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair. "Then you will help me. I confess I am at my wit's end. My sister, Constance Blackwood, has been accused, though not formally charged, of complicity in the death of her employer, Lord Asherton of Elm Street." "Asherton," Holmes repeated, his fingers steepling before his face. "The industrialist. I read of his death in yesterday's evening edition." The report was sparse on details, mentioning only that he was found dead in his study, under mysterious circumstances. "What are the particulars that bring you to me at this unseemly hour?" The Major withdrew a handkerchief and mopped his brow despite the chill of the evening. "Lord Asherton was found 3 nights ago on Monday evening, seated at his desk, with a half-written letter before him. The door to his study was locked from the inside, and the key was in the lock. The windows were fastened, and there was no sign of forced entry. Yet he was quite dead, poisoned by what the medical examiner believes to be a rare toxin, possibly of Eastern origin." "And your sister's connection to this unfortunate gentleman?" I interjected, unable to restrain my curiosity. "Constance has served as Lord Asherton's private secretary for the past 2 years. She was the last person known to have seen him alive, having brought him his evening tea at approximately 7 o'clock that evening. Lord Asherton dismissed her shortly thereafter, and she departed the house, or so she claims." The body was discovered by the butler at 9 o'clock, when Lord Asherton failed to appear for dinner. Holmes's eyes glittered with interest. Inspector Lestrade is handling the case, I presume. Inspector Gregson, actually. He has been most courteous, but I sense he believes my sister is withholding information. There are complications that cast suspicion upon her. Do elaborate, Major. In matters of this nature, no detail is too trivial. Major Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lord Asherton had recently altered his will, making generous provision for Constance, a bequest of £5,000 and a cottage on his estate in Surrey. This became known only after his death, when the solicitor read the will to the family. Moreover, there were those in the household who claimed that Lord Asherton and my sister enjoyed a relationship that exceeded the bounds of professional propriety. I see, Holmes said quietly, his expression revealing nothing. And what is your sister's character? Do you believe her capable of such an act? Absolutely not. The Major's response was immediate and forceful. Constance is the most honorable woman I know. She is intelligent, resourceful, and possessed of a strong moral compass. Whatever relationship she had with Lord Asherton, I am certain it was entirely proper. She took the position out of necessity after our father's death left her with limited means, and she has conducted herself with dignity throughout. Holmes rose from his chair and paced to the window, drawing aside the curtain to gaze out into the fog-shrouded street below. For a long moment he remained silent, and I could see his profile sharp against the lamplight, his mind already at work upon the puzzle before him. "Your sister's current whereabouts?" he asked without turning. "She remains at the Asherton household in Elm Street. The family has not dismissed her, though the atmosphere is, as you might imagine, quite strained. Lord Asherton's son, Geoffrey, has been surprisingly supportive, but Lady Asherton and the younger daughter, Miss Evelyn, regard her with barely concealed hostility." "Interesting." Holmes turned back to face our visitor. "Tell me, Major, what brought you to my door tonight rather than yesterday or tomorrow? What has happened to precipitate this midnight consultation?" The Major's face grew even more troubled. "This evening, Constance managed to send me a brief note through a trusted servant. She wrote that she has discovered something, some piece of evidence that may exonerate her, but she fears to reveal it to the police without first consulting someone who might understand its significance. She asks that I bring you to Elm Street tomorrow morning, if you are willing. She believes her life may be in danger, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyebrows arched slightly. "Her life?" "She believes someone in that household wishes her harm." She did not elaborate, but her fear was evident in every word. "Please, Mr. Holmes, I know I come to you with little more than a sister's desperate plea, but if there is any justice in this world, you will help us uncover it." My friend returned to his chair, his decision apparently made. "Very well, Major Blackwood. Dr. Watson and I shall present ourselves at the Asherton residence at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest you return to your lodgings and get what rest you can. And, Major," Holmes fixed him with a penetrating stare, "I trust you will mention this visit to no one, not even your sister. Let it appear that you have engaged me through official channels, if you must provide explanation at all." The Major rose, relief evident in every line of his bearing. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I cannot express my gratitude sufficiently." When our visitor had departed, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been forming in my mind throughout the interview. "Holmes, you accepted this case with remarkable alacrity. What interests you particularly about this affair?" My friend had resumed his position in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic pose of concentration. "Several elements intrigue me, Watson. First, the locked room, always a fascinating puzzle. Second, the suggestion of poison, particularly one of Eastern origin, which introduces an exotic element to an otherwise domestic tragedy. But most compelling is the obvious fact that Major Blackwood has not told us everything. Not told us everything. But he seemed entirely forthright. Oh, he was honest enough within the bounds of what he chose to reveal. But did you not notice the way his hand moved unconsciously to his inner pocket when he mentioned his sister's note? There was something else in that message, Watson. Something he deemed too sensitive or too damning to share even with me. And that, my dear fellow, is precisely what makes this case worth investigating." Holmes rose and moved to his desk, where he began sorting through a stack of newspapers, clearly seeking earlier accounts of Lord Asherton's death. "We shall learn more tomorrow, no doubt, but tonight I suggest you ensure your service revolver is in good working order. If Miss Constance Blackwood is correct in her fears, we may be walking into a household where murder has already been committed, and where the killer walks freely among the living, watching and waiting for the next opportunity to strike. I felt a familiar thrill course through me. That peculiar mixture of apprehension and excitement that always accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's investigations. As I retired to my room, I could hear him still moving about the sitting room, the scratch of his pen suggesting he was already making notes, already constructing theories about what we might discover on the morrow. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was afoot. The morning arrived with a pale, hesitant sun that struggled to penetrate the lingering fog. I descended to our sitting room to find Holmes already dressed and standing before the fireplace, examining a small vial of amber liquid held up to the light. His keen eyes studied the contents with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a precious stone. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, "I trust you slept well? I confess I found myself unable to rest, so I have spent the early hours reviewing what little the newspapers have revealed about Lord Asherton's demise. The accounts are frustratingly vague, which suggests either police discretion or genuine bafflement on the part of the investigators." I poured myself coffee from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided. "What have you there, Holmes?" "A tincture of belladonna, merely." I was refreshing my memory regarding the symptoms of various botanical poisons. If the medical examiner is correct about an Eastern toxin, we may be dealing with something far more exotic than the common poisons available to the average English household. The selection of poison itself may prove instructive. It speaks to either specialized knowledge or access to unusual substances. He set down the vial and consulted his pocket watch. "We have an hour before our appointment." I took the liberty of sending a telegram to Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard, informing him of my involvement in the case. Professional courtesy, Watson, though I suspect he will be less than delighted by my intrusion. Gregson is a capable man within his limitations, but he lacks the imagination necessary for truly complex cases. We breakfasted quickly, and shortly before 10 o'clock, we secured a hansom cab that carried us through the gradually clearing streets toward Mayfair. Elm Street proved to be one of those quiet, respectable thoroughfares favored by the wealthy but not ostentatious members of London society. The houses were substantial Georgian structures, set back from the street behind iron railings and small, well-maintained gardens. Number 17 was distinguished by its black-painted door and the wreath of mourning that hung upon it. As our cab drew to a halt, I observed a constable standing at discreet attention near the corner. Gregson had clearly maintained a police presence, whether to protect potential evidence or to monitor the household's inhabitants, I could not say. Holmes paid the driver and approached the door with the confident stride of a man who knew his business. The bell was answered by a butler, whose dignified bearing could not entirely conceal the strain of recent events. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with silver hair and the ramrod posture of one who had served in great houses all his life. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," my friend announced. "We are expected by Major Blackwood." The butler's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Was it relief I detected or apprehension? "Of course, sir. Major Blackwood informed me of your visit. I am Carruthers, the butler. If you will follow me, the family has gathered in the morning room. Inspector Gregson is also present." We were led through an entrance hall panelled in dark oak, past a sweeping staircase, and into a spacious morning room where 5 individuals awaited us. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as palpable as the fog outside had been. Major Blackwood rose immediately upon our entrance, relief evident in his features. Beside him sat a young woman of perhaps 30 years, whose intelligent dark eyes and composed demeanour marked her unmistakably as his sister. Despite the obvious strain she was under, Constance Blackwood maintained an air of quiet dignity that spoke well of her character. The remaining 3 occupants of the room presented a study in contrasts. Inspector Gregson, whom I recognized from previous cases, stood by the window with his arms crossed and an expression of professional skepticism. He was a tall, fair-haired man with sharp features and the perpetually wary look of one who has dealt with too many criminals. Seated near the fireplace was a young man of approximately 25, dark-haired and handsome in a somewhat dissipated fashion. His expensive mourning clothes could not disguise a certain weakness about the mouth and eyes that suggested a character lacking in resolution. This, I surmised, must be Geoffrey Asherton, the late Lord's son. The final member of this assembly was a striking woman of middle years, dressed in elaborate widow's weeds. Lady Asherton possessed the kind of beauty that had once been remarkable, but now showed the effects of time and perhaps disappointment. Her eyes, when they fell upon Holmes, were cold and calculating. "Mr. Holmes," Gregson began, his tone carefully neutral, "I received your telegram. While I appreciate your interest in this case, I should inform you that Scotland Yard has matters well in hand. We have conducted a thorough investigation." Holmes ignored this entirely and turned instead to Major Blackwood. "Major, thank you for arranging this meeting. With your permission, I should like to hear directly from your sister regarding the events of Monday evening." Lady Asherton rose abruptly, her face flushing with anger. "I protest most strongly, Mr. Holmes. This woman stands accused of poisoning my husband, yet she remains in my home. And now you propose to grant her yet another opportunity to spin her lies. It is insupportable." "Mother, please," Geoffrey Asherton interjected, his voice weary. "We agreed to allow Major Blackwood to engage private assistance. If Mr. Holmes's reputation is deserved, surely we should welcome any light he might shed upon this tragedy. Your father lies dead, Geoffrey, and you defend his murderess." Lady Asherton's voice rose to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. She wormed her way into his confidence, encouraged his unnatural interest, and when he made her his beneficiary, Holmes's eyebrows arched slightly. "Her life? She believes someone in that household wishes her harm." She did not elaborate, but her fear was evident in every word. "Please, Mr. Holmes, I know I come to you with little more than a sister's desperate plea, but if there is any justice in this world, you will help us uncover it." My friend returned to his chair, his decision apparently made. "Very well, Major Blackwood. Dr. Watson and I shall present ourselves at the Asherton residence at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest you return to your lodgings and get what rest you can. And, Major," Holmes fixed him with a penetrating stare, "I trust you will mention this visit to no one, not even your sister. Let it appear that you have engaged me through official channels, if you must provide explanation at all." "That will do, Lady Asherton," Holmes said quietly, but with such authority that the woman fell silent mid-sentence. "I understand your grief and your suspicions. However, I must conduct my investigation without prejudice, examining only facts and evidence. Now, Miss Blackwood, if you would be so kind as to recount the events of Monday evening, omitting no detail. However insignificant it may seem." Constance Blackwood straightened in her chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the hostility radiating from Lady Asherton. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I had been working with Lord Asherton in his study throughout the afternoon, assisting with correspondence regarding his railway investments. At approximately 6:30, he dismissed me so that I might take my evening meal. I dined alone in the small parlour adjacent to the library, as was my custom. At 7 o'clock I prepared Lord Asherton's tea. He was particular about having Darjeeling at that hour, and brought it to his study." "The tea," Holmes interrupted. "Where did you prepare it?" "In the small pantry near the study. Lord Asherton preferred that I prepare his evening tea there, rather than waiting for it to be brought up from the kitchen. He said the walk from the kitchen allowed it to cool too much for his taste. And who else had access to this pantry? Anyone in the household, theoretically. It is not locked. However, at that hour, most of the servants would have been occupied with dinner preparations below stairs." Holmes nodded. "Continue, please. I brought the tea tray to the study. Lord Asherton was at his desk, writing. He seemed preoccupied but not distressed. He thanked me, told me I was free for the evening, and asked me to lock the study door behind me when I left. This was not unusual. He often desired privacy for his work." "Did you lock the door?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I turned the key and heard the bolt slide home. I even tested the handle to ensure it was secure, as Lord Asherton had once been quite annoyed when I failed to lock it properly." Inspector Gregson shifted his weight, clearly impatient with this recitation of facts he had already heard. "Tell Mr. Holmes what you did next, Miss Blackwood." A faint colour rose in Constance's cheeks. "I went to my room to change for the evening. Then I left the house through the servants' entrance." "At what time?" Holmes asked sharply. "It must have been approximately 7:30. "And where did you go?" The silence that followed Holmes's question stretched uncomfortably. Constance Blackwood's composure, which had remained admirably intact thus far, showed the first signs of wavering. Her eyes dropped to her folded hands, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its steadiness. I walked in the park nearby. I needed air time to think. The fog was beginning to settle, but I did not mind it. I walked for perhaps an hour, then returned to the house through the same entrance I had used to leave. Did anyone see you during this walk? Holmes's tone was not unkind, but it pressed for truth with relentless precision. I cannot be certain. The fog was quite thick by then, and there were few people about. I may have passed one or two individuals, but I did not know them, nor did I speak to anyone. Lady Asherton made a sound of derision. How very convenient. An hour's absence with no witnesses, during which time my husband was poisoned in a locked room. Inspector Gregson, surely even you must see the obvious conclusion. Holmes held up a hand to forestall the inspector's response. Miss Blackwood, I must ask you directly, was there any particular reason you chose that evening to take such a walk? Any specific matter troubling your mind? The colour in Constance's cheeks deepened. Lord Asherton had, that afternoon, he had made me an offer of marriage. The effect of this revelation upon the room was electric. Geoffrey Asherton started visibly in his chair, while Lady Asherton's face transformed from anger to something approaching horror. Even Inspector Gregson's professional mask slipped momentarily to reveal surprise. I see, Holmes said calmly, as though she had mentioned nothing more remarkable than a change in the weather. And your response to this proposal? I told him I needed time to consider it. He was most understanding. He said he would await my answer, that there was no urgency. But I felt overwhelmed, confused. Hence the walk. Constance's voice grew firmer as she continued. Lord Asherton was a kind man, a good man. He had shown me nothing but respect and consideration during my time in his employ. But I was conscious of the disparity in our positions, our ages, and, she glanced at Lady Asherton, the complications such a union would create. I needed to think clearly away from the house. And when you returned. What time was this? Shortly before 8:30. I entered through the servants' entrance as I had left. I went directly to my room and remained there for the rest of the evening. I heard the commotion when Lord Asherton's body was discovered, but I did not learn the particulars until the following morning. Holmes turned to Carruthers, who had remained standing quietly near the door. You discovered the body, I understand. The butler inclined his head. Yes, sir. Lord Asherton customarily took his evening meal at 9 o'clock sharp. When he failed to appear in the dining room, I went to his study. I knocked several times, receiving no response. The door was locked. I became concerned and used my master key to enter. I found Lord Asherton slumped forward on his desk, quite dead. The teacup was beside him, nearly empty. The key, Holmes said intently. You say the door was locked from the inside? Yes, sir. Lord Asherton's key was in the lock on the interior side. I had to remove it before I could insert my own key from the outside. Impossible for anyone to have locked it from outside the room then. Quite impossible, sir. I examined the mechanism myself at Inspector Gregson's request. The lock is of a simple but secure design. Once the key is turned from the inside, no manipulation from the outside could engage the bolt. Holmes crossed to the window, his fingers drumming against his thigh in that characteristic gesture that indicated intense mental activity. Inspector Gregson, you have examined the teacup, I presume? Naturally, Gregson replied with some stiffness. It contained traces of the poison, a substance the medical examiner has tentatively identified as aconite, though in an unusually concentrated form. The entire contents of the cup were poisoned. Whoever administered it intended certain death. Aconite, Holmes murmured. Wolfsbane, a most interesting choice. It grows wild in certain parts of England, though the concentration required for a fatal dose would necessitate some expertise in extraction. The symptoms are quite distinctive: numbness, nausea, cardiac irregularity. Death can occur within hours or even minutes, depending on the dose. Did Lord Asherton show signs of distress before he died? The medical examiner believes death was relatively swift, Gregson said. Perhaps 20 to 30 minutes after ingestion. There were no signs that Lord Asherton attempted to summon help or raise an alarm. which suggests he did not immediately recognize he had been poisoned, I interjected. Or perhaps the initial symptoms were not alarming enough to cause concern. Holmes nodded absently, his attention seemingly focused on the view from the window. Miss Blackwood, when you prepared the tea, did you add anything to it beyond the usual? Sugar, as Lord Asherton preferred it. 2 lumps, nothing else. And the tea leaves themselves? Where were they kept? In a canister in the pantry. The same canister had been in use for several days. Lord Asherton was quite particular about his Darjeeling, and would have noticed immediately if a different variety had been substituted. Quite so. Holmes turned back to face the room, and I recognized the peculiar intensity in his expression that indicated he had observed something of significance. Lady Asherton, I must ask you to describe your movements on Monday evening. The widow's eyes flashed dangerously. I was in the drawing-room receiving Lady Pemberton and her daughter for tea. They remained until nearly 8 o'clock. After their departure, I went to my chambers to rest before dinner. I have witnesses to my whereabouts throughout the relevant period. And you, Mr. Asherton? Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably under Holmes's scrutiny. I was at my club until late afternoon. I returned home around 6, dined in my rooms. I had no appetite for company, and remained there until I heard Carruthers raising the alarm about my father. Your relationship with your father, it was cordial. A shadow passed across the young man's features. My father and I had our differences, Mr. Holmes. He disapproved of certain aspects of my lifestyle, and we argued occasionally about financial matters. But I loved him, and I would never have harmed him. The suggestion is monstrous. No one has suggested anything, Mr. Asherton, Holmes replied mildly. I am merely establishing the facts. Now, Inspector, I should very much like to examine the study where Lord Asherton died. Has the room been disturbed since the body was removed? We've kept it sealed, as is procedure, Gregson said, though I'm not certain what you expect to find that my men haven't already discovered. Perhaps nothing, Holmes conceded. Or perhaps everything. The difference, Inspector, often lies in knowing what one is looking for. Carruthers, if you would be so good as to show us to the study. The butler led our small procession through the hallway and down a corridor that terminated at a heavy oak door. Carruthers produced a key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocked it with a solemnity befitting the opening of a tomb. The door swung inward with a faint creak, revealing a spacious study lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk positioned before a pair of tall windows. The room had been left largely undisturbed, as Gregson had indicated. Papers were scattered across the desk's surface, and a leather chair stood pushed back at an angle, as though its occupant had risen suddenly or slumped forward. The teacup and saucer remained on the desk's corner, the porcelain gleaming dully in the grey morning light that filtered through the windows. Holmes entered with the focused intensity of a predator examining its territory. His eyes swept the room in a comprehensive glance before he began a more detailed inspection, moving with deliberate care around the perimeter. I had witnessed this ritual many times before, the methodical examination that missed nothing, the careful mental cataloguing of every detail, however minute. Inspector Gregson stood just inside the doorway, his arms crossed, and his expression suggesting he expected this exercise to prove fruitless. Major Blackwood and his sister had followed us, though Constance remained near the threshold, her face pale as she gazed at the room where her employer had met his end. The windows, Holmes said, approaching them and examining the latches. They were fastened when you entered, Carruthers. Yes, sir. Securely fastened, both of them. Lord Asherton was particular about drafts. Holmes tested each latch himself, then peered closely at the windowsill and the frame. He produced his magnifying glass from his pocket and subjected the wood to intense scrutiny. After several moments, he straightened and moved to the fireplace on the opposite wall. A fire was burning that evening? Yes, sir. I laid it myself at 6 o'clock, as was my custom. Lord Asherton appreciated warmth while he worked. Holmes knelt before the hearth, examining the grate and the surrounding brickwork. He poked at the cold ashes with a poker, then ran his fingers along the mantelpiece, inspecting them afterward with interest. Whatever he found or failed to find provoked no comment, and he continued his circuit of the room. The bookshelves received his attention next. He scanned the titles with swift efficiency, occasionally removing a volume to examine it more closely before replacing it precisely in its original position. I noticed his particular interest in a shelf containing works on botany and natural philosophy, including several texts on Eastern flora. Lord Asherton had scholarly interests, Holmes inquired. His lordship was widely read, Carruthers replied with evident pride. He possessed a keen intellect and enjoyed studying subjects far removed from his business concerns. Botany was among his passions, particularly the medicinal properties of plants. Indeed, that is most interesting. Holmes moved to the desk and stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back. The half-written letter that Major Blackwood had mentioned still lay there, the ink now faded to brown. Holmes bent to read it without touching the paper. A business letter, he observed, concerning railway shares and their projected value. Nothing remarkable in the content, and certainly nothing to suggest distress or premonition of death. The handwriting is steady, showing no signs of agitation. He was interrupted mid-sentence here, Holmes pointed, where he writes, "I am confident that the northern route will prove." The sentence simply stops. The pen was laid aside, not dropped. This suggests he was not yet experiencing severe symptoms when he ceased writing. He must have drunk the tea after writing that, I suggested. The poison would have acted quickly once ingested. Perhaps, Holmes said absently. He lifted the teacup carefully by its handle, holding it up to the light. Traces of tea leaves at the bottom. The residue of sugar crystallized against the porcelain. The cup is from the household service, I presume. Yes, sir, Carruthers confirmed. From the set Lord Asherton preferred for his private use. Holmes set the cup down and turned his attention to the papers on the desk. There were letters, ledgers, financial documents, and several sheets covered with Lord Asherton's precise handwriting, notes and calculations related to his various business ventures. Holmes examined each item with meticulous care, occasionally making soft sounds of interest or contemplation. "Miss Blackwood," he said without looking up from his examination, "you mentioned that Lord Asherton asked you to lock the door when you departed. Was this a common request?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. When he worked on sensitive business matters, he preferred not to be disturbed. He would often lock himself in for hours at a time. And the key, he kept only one key to this room." "No, sir. There were 3 keys, Lord Asherton's own, which he carried on his person. The master key held by Carruthers, and a spare kept in the housekeeper's office." Holmes's head snapped up. "A 3rd key? Inspector Gregson, were you aware of this?" The inspector's face showed momentary discomfort. "Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, mentioned a spare key. We examined it naturally. It was in its proper place in her office, and she confirmed it had not been moved." "I should like to speak with Mrs. Aldridge," Holmes said firmly. "And I should also like to examine this spare key and the housekeeper's office. But first..." He moved to the door and inspected the lock mechanism with his glass, running his fingers around the keyhole and testing the handle repeatedly. After several minutes of this examination, he stepped back into the hallway and called for Carruthers. "Show me precisely how you opened this door. Use your master key as you did that evening." The butler complied, inserting his key from the hallway side. The lock clicked smoothly, and the door opened. Holmes had him repeat the process 3 times, watching with fierce concentration. "And Lord Asherton's key was definitely in the lock on the inside when you first attempted entry." "Most definitely, sir. I could see it through the keyhole when I bent to look. I had to use a piece of wire to push it out before my own key would fit." "You still have this wire?" "I believe so, sir. It would be in the butler's pantry. Fetch it, if you please." While Carruthers departed on this errand, Holmes produced a tape measure and began taking measurements of the door, the frame, and the gap between the door's bottom edge and the floor. He recorded these figures in his notebook with evident satisfaction. Inspector Gregson's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Holmes, we have already conducted a thorough examination of this room and the locking mechanism. I can assure you that no trickery was involved. The door was genuinely locked from the inside, the windows were secured, and there is no other entrance to this room." Miss Blackwood was the last person to see Lord Asherton alive, and she had both the means and the opportunity to poison his tea. "Means and opportunity, yes," Holmes replied, still studying his notebook. "But what of motive, Inspector? A proposal of marriage hardly seems grounds for murder, particularly when the lady could simply have declined the offer." "The will, Mr. Holmes," Gregson said with the air of one explaining the obvious to a child. £5,000 is a substantial sum. Perhaps she knew of the bequest and sought to secure it before Lord Asherton could change his mind about the marriage or about the will itself. Constance Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, now spoke with quiet dignity. "I knew nothing of any bequest until after Lord Asherton's death. I was as shocked as anyone when the will was read." "So you claim, Lady Asherton," interjected from the doorway, where she had appeared without my noticing. "But my husband was peculiarly indiscreet regarding his financial affairs. He may well have mentioned his intentions, hoping to secure your affections." Holmes turned to face Lady Asherton with an expression I could not quite read. "Your ladyship, forgive my indelicacy, but I must ask, were you aware of your husband's intention to propose marriage to Miss Blackwood?" The widow's face hardened into a mask of aristocratic disdain. "I was aware that my husband had developed an unseemly attachment to his secretary. I had spoken to him about it only days before his death. He assured me it was merely a avuncular interest in a young woman of good family fallen on difficult times. Obviously, he deceived me regarding the true nature of his feelings." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly at this admission. "And how did this conversation with your husband conclude? Was there animosity between you on the subject?" Lady Asherton's composure wavered for the briefest moment before reasserting itself. "My husband and I had been married for 27 years, Mr. Holmes. We had long since moved beyond the passions of youth. I was disappointed by his lack of judgment, but we parted on civil terms. He promised to consider my concerns." "Yet, within days he was proposing marriage to the very woman you had objected to," Holmes observed. "A curious response to your expressed concerns." "My father was not a man easily swayed once his mind was fixed upon a course," Geoffrey Asherton interjected, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness. "He listened to advice when it suited him and ignored it when it did not. In recent months he had become increasingly erratic in his decisions." "Erratic? In what manner?" The young man exchanged a glance with his mother before continuing. "His business judgments had grown questionable. He had made several investments against the advice of his partners, investments that showed little promise of success. And his personal conduct, well, this infatuation with Miss Blackwood was merely the latest example of behavior unbefitting a man of his station." Holmes studied Geoffrey with that penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away all pretense. "You were concerned about your inheritance, perhaps. An unsuitable second marriage might have significantly altered your expectations." "I will not pretend filial devotion where there was little enough of it," Geoffrey said with surprising candor. "My father and I had grown distant, but whatever my feelings toward him, I did not kill him. I had no access to his study that evening, and as I have stated, I remained in my rooms throughout the relevant period." "Can anyone corroborate this?" "My valet, Simmons. He attended me during the evening." Holmes made a note in his book just as Carruthers returned, bearing a thin piece of wire perhaps 8 inches in length. Holmes examined it with interest, then requested the master key. What followed was a series of experiments in which my friend repeatedly locked and unlocked the door, inserted the wire through the keyhole, and measured angles and distances with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Finally, he straightened and addressed Inspector Gregson. "You are quite correct, Inspector. The door was genuinely locked from the inside, and I can find no evidence of mechanical trickery. This was indeed a locked room in the truest sense." Gregson's expression suggested vindication. "Then you agree that Miss Blackwood's position is untenable. She was alone with Lord Asherton when the poisoned tea was delivered. The door was locked after she left. No one else could have administered the poison." "I agree to the facts as you have stated them," Holmes replied carefully. "However, facts are curious things, Inspector. They can be arranged to tell many different stories, depending on the pattern one discerns. Now I should like to see the small pantry, where the tea was prepared, and then I must speak with the housekeeper regarding this third key." We retraced our steps down the corridor to a small room that served as an auxiliary pantry. It was a compact space, perhaps 8 feet square, containing a counter with a spirit lamp for heating water, several shelves stocked with tea canisters, sugar, and other necessities, and a small window that looked out onto a narrow side garden. Holmes examined the tea canister that Constance identified as containing the Darjeeling Lord Asherton had preferred. He opened it and sniffed the contents, then wet his finger and touched it to the tea leaves, tasting cautiously. "Pure tea, nothing more," he pronounced. The poison was not in the leaves themselves. "Miss Blackwood, when you prepared the tea that evening, did you leave the tray unattended at any point?" "No, Mr. Holmes. I prepared it and took it directly to the study. The entire process took perhaps 5 minutes. And during those 5 minutes, did anyone enter this pantry or pass through the corridor outside?" Constance considered carefully. "I cannot be certain. I heard footsteps in the hallway at one point, but I did not see who it was. The door to the pantry was partially closed." "The footsteps approaching or receding?" "Receding, I believe. Moving away from the direction of Lord Asherton's study." Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed. That is most suggestive. You did not think to mention this before?" I did not think it significant, Mr. Holmes. There are always servants moving about the house. I cannot even be certain the footsteps were in this corridor rather than an adjacent one. The acoustics in this part of the house are peculiar. Nevertheless, it may prove important." Holmes examined the window, testing its latch and peering out at the garden beyond. The window was small and set rather high in the wall, offering a limited view of the exterior. "This window, is it generally kept locked?" "I believe so, sir," Carruthers replied. "Mrs. Aldridge is most particular about security." Holmes experimented with the latch, opening and closing the window several times. It moved smoothly, well-maintained, and recently oiled. He leaned out, examining the exterior wall and the garden. Below with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the wall beneath the window. When he withdrew, his expression had grown thoughtful. "Watson, your observations on the garden below, what do you see?" I leaned out as he had done, though without his glass. "A narrow flower bed, somewhat overgrown. The earth appears recently, disturbed in places, though whether by gardening or other causes I cannot say. Beyond that, a brick path leading around the corner of the house." "Excellent. You are learning, my dear fellow. The earth is indeed disturbed, and if one looks closely, one can discern the impression of boots, a man's boots, size 9 or 10, with a distinctive pattern to the sole. The impressions are relatively fresh, made within the last few days, I should estimate." Inspector Gregson had joined us at the window. "Many people have access to these gardens, Mr. Holmes. Gardeners, servants taking shortcuts to the various entrances. Such footprints prove nothing." "Perhaps not," Holmes conceded, "though it is curious that the prints lead directly beneath this window and then away again, with no apparent gardening work done in that immediate vicinity. But come, Inspector, let us not quibble over evidence whose significance has yet to be determined. I wish to speak with Mrs. Aldridge." The housekeeper proved to be a formidable woman of approximately 50 years, with iron-grey hair and the bearing of one accustomed to running a large household with absolute authority. She received us in her office, a tidy room filled with ledgers and household accounts, and answered Holmes's questions with the precision of a military officer delivering a report. "The spare key to his lordship's study has hung on that hook." She indicated a small board mounted on the wall bearing various labelled keys. "For as long as I have been in this household, which is 15 years, it is checked regularly as part of our security procedures, and it was in its place when I made my evening rounds on Monday at 8 o'clock. "You are certain of the time?" "Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes. I maintain a strict schedule. I check the keys at 8 o'clock every evening without fail." "And after 8 o'clock? Could someone have taken the key after your inspection?" Mrs. Aldridge's expression suggested this was a personal affront. "This office is locked whenever I am not present. I carry the only key to this room on my person at all times." Holmes examined the keyboard carefully, then turned his attention to the office itself. Like the pantry, it had a window, though this one looked out onto the main garden at the rear of the house. He tested the latch and found it secure. "Mrs. Aldridge, who has regular access to this office besides yourself?" "No one, sir. Lord Asherton himself would occasionally enter when he required a spare key for some purpose. But otherwise this is my private domain. And on Monday evening, after your 8 o'clock inspection, where were you?" I supervised the dinner service, as was my custom. Afterward, I retired to my quarters to complete some accounts. I was there when Carruthers raised the alarm. Holmes thanked her for her cooperation, and we retreated back into the corridor. Inspector Gregson, who had been growing increasingly impatient throughout these interviews, finally voiced his frustration. "Mr. Holmes, I have indulged your methods thus far, but I must protest that we are making no progress whatsoever. We have established nothing that my own investigation had not already discovered. The facts remain unchanged. Lord Asherton was poisoned in a locked room, and Miss Blackwood was the only person with opportunity to administer that poison. Unless you can demonstrate otherwise, I shall be obliged to place her under formal arrest by day's end." Holmes turned to face the inspector, and I detected a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "You would arrest her based on opportunity alone? What of the poison itself, Inspector? Have you determined how Miss Blackwood might have obtained aconite in such concentrated form? Have you searched her quarters for any trace of the substance?" Gregson shifted uncomfortably. "We found nothing in her room, but she could have disposed of any evidence during her convenient walk in the fog. As for obtaining the poison, a woman of her intelligence could easily have extracted it from plants growing wild in any number of locations. Those botanical texts in Lord Asherton's study were accessible to her. She had the knowledge, did she indeed?" Holmes's voice was soft but carried an undertone of steel. "Tell me, Inspector, have you read those botanical texts yourself? Do you know what expertise would be required to extract and concentrate aconite to a fatal dose? It is not a simple matter of crushing leaves and adding them to tea. The process requires specific knowledge of chemistry, access to laboratory equipment, and considerable time. Where is your evidence that Miss Blackwood possessed such capabilities or had access to the necessary resources?" "She could have purchased the poison ready-made," Gregson countered, though with less certainty. "There are chemists who deal in such substances for legitimate purposes. Then I suggest you make inquiries at every chemist in London who might stock such exotic preparations. You will find, I think, that such purchases are carefully recorded, and that no record exists of Miss Blackwood acquiring anything of the sort. But please do pursue that line of investigation. It will at least keep you occupied while I continue my own inquiries." Before Gregson could formulate a response, Holmes turned to Major Blackwood. "I require access to Miss Blackwood's room." "With her permission, naturally." Constance nodded her assent, and we followed her up the main staircase to the second floor. Her quarters proved to be modest but comfortable, consisting of a bedroom and a small sitting room that doubled as an office. The furnishings were simple, and the shelves contained books that spoke of a cultivated mind, works of literature, history and philosophy, but notably nothing relating to botany or chemistry. Holmes conducted his search with characteristic thoroughness, examining every drawer, every book, even the linings of Constance's garments in the wardrobe. He inspected the window, the fireplace, and even the floorboards. After 20 minutes of this intensive examination, he straightened and addressed the room's occupant. "Miss Blackwood, you mentioned in your brother's presence last night that you had discovered something that might exonerate you. I believe now is the time to reveal what you have found." Constance glanced at her brother, who gave an encouraging nod. She moved to her writing desk and withdrew a small leather-bound diary from a locked drawer. "This belonged to Lord Asherton. I found it in his study 2 days ago, hidden behind a loose panel in one of the bookshelves. I discovered the panel quite by accident when I knocked against the shelf while retrieving a volume." Holmes took the diary with evident interest. "You removed evidence from the scene of a crime. That was most unwise, Miss Blackwood. I know, Mr. Holmes, and I have regretted it every moment since. But when I read what it contained, I panicked. I feared that if it fell into the wrong hands, it would be used against me rather than in my favor." Holmes opened the diary and began reading, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages. The rest of us waited in tense silence. I observed that the diary was perhaps a third full, with entries dating back several months. Holmes read for several minutes, occasionally pausing to study a particular passage more closely. Finally he looked up, his expression grave. "This is indeed significant. Major Blackwood, Inspector Gregson, you should both see this. Lord Asherton was being blackmailed." The effect of this pronouncement was immediate. Gregson strode forward and took the diary from Holmes's hands, reading the indicated passages with growing astonishment. Major Blackwood peered over his shoulder, his face darkening with anger as he absorbed the contents. Good God, the Major breathed. He was paying someone £500 monthly to keep some secret. But the nature of the secret is not specified. No, Holmes agreed. Lord Asherton was careful to record only the fact of the payments and his growing resentment of them. However, note the entry dated 3 weeks ago. He writes that he has determined the identity of his blackmailer and intends to confront them. The subsequent entries show increasing agitation, and the final entry, dated the day before his death, states quite clearly, "I have made my decision. Tomorrow I shall end this intolerable situation once and for all. Let the consequences fall where they may." Inspector Gregson's face had gone pale. This changes everything. If Lord Asherton was threatening to expose his blackmailer, that person would have had a powerful motive for murder. Indeed, Holmes said. And suddenly our locked room mystery takes on an entirely new complexion. The question is no longer simply how the poison was administered, but who among Lord Asherton's circle would have had reason to blackmail him, and what secret was worth killing to protect. But who? Major Blackwood demanded. There is no name mentioned, no hint of the blackmailer's identity. Holmes retrieved the diary and turned to a page near the end. Not explicitly, perhaps, but Lord Asherton was clever in his own way. Look here at this passage from 10 days ago. The mask of respectability conceals a desperate character. I had not thought one of my own household capable of such calculation. The botanical knowledge displayed is considerable. Ironic that my own passion for the subject should have provided the means for my torment. Botanical knowledge, I repeated. Then the blackmailer must be someone who shared Lord Asherton's interest in plants and their properties. Precisely, Watson. And who in this household would fit such a description? Holmes fixed each of us with his penetrating gaze in turn. We must consider everyone who had both opportunity and botanical expertise. Miss Blackwood, did Lord Asherton discuss his interest in medicinal plants with members of his household? Occasionally, Mr. Holmes. He was enthusiastic about the subject and would sometimes share interesting discoveries from his reading. His son Geoffrey had studied natural sciences at university and would engage him in discussion. Even Lady Asherton had some knowledge, as she maintained an extensive herb garden for household use. A herb garden? Holmes's interest sharpened. Where is this garden located? At the rear of the property, beyond the main lawn. Lady Asherton takes great pride in it. She cultivates both culinary and medicinal herbs. Inspector, Holmes said decisively, I suggest we examine this garden immediately, and I should like to speak with Lady Asherton's gardener, if she employs one. We descended once more to the ground floor, where Carruthers informed us that Lady Asherton maintained the herb garden herself, with only occasional assistance from the general groundskeeper. The butler led us through the house to a rear entrance that opened onto a terrace overlooking extensive grounds. The herb garden was situated to the left of the main lawn, enclosed by a low hedge. As we approached, I could see it was indeed extensive, with carefully tended beds arranged in geometric patterns. Various plants were labelled with small wooden markers, and even in late autumn many specimens remained green and vigorous. Holmes moved along the beds with the focused attention of a botanist conducting research. He paused before one particular section, studying the plants there with his magnifying glass. Monkshood, he announced. Hayconatum napellus, to use the proper designation, otherwise known as wolfsbane, the very plant from which our poison was derived. Inspector Gregson joined him, staring down at the innocent-looking purple flowers. Lady Asherton grows the poison that killed her husband in her own garden. It appears so. Though, to be fair, monkshood is commonly cultivated for its ornamental qualities. Many gardeners grow it without any sinister intent. Holmes knelt beside the plant, examining the soil around its base. However, note here, several root sections have been recently removed. The earth has been disturbed within the past week, I should estimate, and poorly concealed. Someone has been harvesting from this plant. We must speak with Lady Asherton at once, Gregson declared, his professional skepticism now thoroughly engaged. If she has been extracting poison from her own garden— A moment, Inspector, Holmes interrupted, still examining the disturbed earth. Let us not rush to conclusions. Lady Asherton is not the only person with access to this garden. Anyone in the household could have come here, particularly at night when the grounds would be unobserved. Moreover, The extraction and concentration of aconite from raw plant material requires not merely access to the plant itself, but also the facilities to process it. We must determine who in this household possesses both the knowledge and the means. He rose from his examination and cast his gaze about the garden with evident calculation. Watson, note the position of this bed relative to the house. Which windows overlook this location? I surveyed the rear facade of the building, the drawing room on the ground floor, and several bedroom windows above. From this angle, I cannot determine which chambers they represent. Carruthers, Holmes called to the butler, who had maintained a respectful distance during our investigation. Which rooms occupy the rear of the house on the first floor? Lady Asherton's chambers are at the far right, sir. Mr. Jeffrey's rooms are adjacent to hers. The centre windows belong to the late Lord Asherton's bedroom, which has remained unused since his lordship preferred to sleep in his dressing room adjoining the study. The windows on the left are guest chambers currently unoccupied, and Miss Blackwood's quarters. Face the side garden, sir, with no view of this location. Holmes nodded, as though this information confirmed some private theory. He walked the perimeter of the herb garden, occasionally stopping to examine particular plants, or to measure distances with his eyes. His investigation led him to a small potting shed tucked against the garden wall, partially concealed by climbing roses. The shed's door was unlocked. Holmes entered, and I followed, finding myself in a cramped space containing gardening implements, pots, bags of soil, and various bottles and containers arranged on shelves. Holmes began examining these containers with intense interest, reading labels and occasionally uncorking a bottle to smell its contents. Fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, he murmured. All common enough. But here, he lifted a small glass vessel containing a clear liquid. This is interesting. An alcohol-based tincture of some kind, though the label has been removed. Recently removed, I should say, given the residual adhesive. He uncorked the bottle and took a cautious sniff, then stopped it immediately. Organic compound, almost certainly plant-derived. Inspector, this should be sent to your laboratory for analysis. I suspect it may prove relevant to our investigation. Gregson took the bottle with evident satisfaction. If this contains aconite, we may have found our murder weapon. And if Lady Asherton is responsible for its presence here, we have found a bottle in a garden shed accessible to everyone in the household, Holmes corrected. Let us not construct theories beyond what the evidence warrants. Now I believe it is time we assembled all parties and addressed certain questions that have been troubling me since we arrived. We returned to the house, where Carruthers was dispatched to gather the household in the drawing room. Within 15 minutes, the principal actors in our drama had assembled. Lady Asherton, pale and imperious in her widow's weeds, Geoffrey Asherton, slouching in an armchair with an expression of bored resignation, Constance Blackwood, seated beside her brother with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and various servants including Carruthers, Mrs. Aldridge, and a nervous young man who was introduced as Simmons, Geoffrey's valet. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, and surveyed the assembly with an air of theatrical gravitas that I recognized as the prelude to revelation. Inspector Gregson positioned himself near the door, ready to prevent any attempt at flight. "We are gathered," Holmes began, "to discuss the death of Lord Asherton and the circumstances surrounding it. I have conducted a thorough examination of the evidence, and while certain mysteries remain, I believe I can now shed light on several important aspects of this case." Lady Asherton's expression was one of carefully controlled anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, I trust you have satisfied yourself that my husband's death was the work of that woman." She gestured toward Constance without looking at her. "The evidence against her is overwhelming. On the contrary, your ladyship, the evidence against Miss Blackwood is largely circumstantial and relies upon an incomplete understanding of the facts. For instance, we now know that Lord Asherton was being blackmailed, a detail that introduces an entirely new motive for his murder, a motive unconnected to Miss Blackwood." Geoffrey Asherton sat forward abruptly. "Blackmailed? My father? That's absurd. Who would dare to blackmail a man of his standing?" "Someone who possessed knowledge of a secret sufficiently damaging that your father was willing to pay £500 monthly to keep it hidden," Holmes replied. A secret that, according to his diary, he had finally decided to expose regardless of the consequences. That decision, I believe, signed his death warrant. What secret? Lady Asherton demanded, her voice rising. My husband had nothing to hide. He was a man of impeccable reputation. Was he indeed? Holmes's tone was mild, but his gaze was sharp. Then perhaps you can explain why he was making substantial monthly payments to an unnamed recipient, payments that caused him considerable distress, and which he characterized in his private diary as intolerable. The widow's face had gone white. I know nothing of such payments. My husband's business affairs were his own concern. Yet you were aware of his intention to marry Miss Blackwood, and you objected to it strenuously. Might not your objection have been motivated by something more than mere concern for social propriety? Perhaps you feared what such a marriage would reveal about your own position in this household. Lady Asherton rose to her feet, trembling with rage or fear, I could not determine which. How dare you suggest I have been a faithful wife for nearly 3 decades? If my husband chose to make a fool of himself over a young secretary, that does not implicate me in his death. Please, your ladyship, compose yourself. Holmes's voice remained calm. I have suggested nothing, except that the circumstances of your husband's death are more complex than they initially appeared. Now I must ask you directly, were you aware that monkshood, the source of the poison that killed your husband, grows in your herb garden? Of course I was aware. I planted it myself years ago. It is attractive and no more dangerous than a dozen other plants in that garden if one has the sense not to consume them. And have you harvested any portion of the monkshood recently? Certainly not. I have no use for such a plant beyond its decorative value. Holmes turned his attention to Geoffrey. Mr. Asherton, you studied natural sciences at university. That would have included botany and possibly chemistry? The young man shrugged. I read natural sciences at Cambridge, yes. It was my father's insistence. I would have preferred law or the diplomatic service, but he had fixed ideas about proper education. So you would possess the knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate botanical poisons. In theory, I suppose, though I assure you such knowledge is purely academic. I have no practical experience in such matters, nor any desire to acquire it. Yet you had the means and the knowledge, and you admit to a strained relationship with your father. You mentioned financial disputes. Were these disputes serious? Geoffrey's expression darkened. My father controlled my allowance with an iron fist. He disapproved of my lifestyle, my friends, my expenditures. We argued frequently about it. But argument is not murder, Mr. Holmes. No, indeed. But financial pressure can be a powerful motive, particularly when combined with the prospect of a new marriage that might alter inheritance expectations. Holmes paused, letting this observation settle over the room. Tell me, Mr. Asherton, where were you between 7 and 8 o'clock on Monday evening? You stated you were in your rooms attended by your valet. That is correct. Holmes turned to Simmons, the valet, who had been standing quietly near the door. You can confirm this? The young man's face flushed. That is, sir. Mr. Geoffrey rang for me at approximately 7:30. I attended him until nearly 9 o'clock, helping him dress for dinner. So he rang for you at 7:30. Where was he before that time? Simmons's discomfort grew visibly. I cannot say, sir. I was in the servants' hall during that period. Cannot say or will not say. Holmes's voice sharpened. Come now, man, a man's life hangs in the balance, perhaps several lives. The truth, if you please. The valet glanced desperately at his employer, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Geoffrey was not in his rooms when I answered his bell, sir. I found him in the corridor near the back stairs. He seemed agitated. He told me he had been walking to clear his head. The back stairs, Holmes repeated, which lead down to the ground floor, near the pantry where the tea was prepared. How very interesting. Geoffrey Asherton leaped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. Are you suggesting that I poisoned my own father? I was nowhere near his study that evening. The door was locked, as has been established beyond doubt. Please sit down, Mr. Asherton, Holmes said with a calmness that seemed to infuriate the young man further. I am merely establishing the movements of all parties during the relevant period. You were near the pantry at approximately the time Miss Blackwood was preparing the tea. That is a fact, not an accusation. What I find curious is that you did not mention this walk when first questioned. Why the omission? Geoffrey sank back into his chair, his defiance giving way to something approaching desperation. I did not think it relevant. So I was upset, as I often was after arguments with my father. We had quarreled that afternoon about money, again. I walked the corridors to calm myself. I saw no one, spoke to no one. What significance could such a walk possibly have? Perhaps none, Holmes conceded. Or perhaps a great deal. It depends upon what you observed during this walk. Did you see Miss Blackwood in the pantry? I may have glimpsed someone, but I paid no attention. My mind was occupied with my own troubles. And did you pass near your father's study? I passed the corridor that leads to it, yes. But the door was closed and I heard nothing from within. Holmes paced slowly before the fireplace, his fingers steepled in contemplation. We have established several important facts. The poison came from monkshood growing in Lady Asherton's garden. Someone with botanical and chemical knowledge extracted and concentrated it. The poisoned tea was prepared in a pantry, accessible to all members of the household. Lord Asherton was killed in a locked room, with no apparent means of entry after the door was secured. And throughout all of this, Lord Asherton was being blackmailed about some undisclosed matter, a blackmail he had determined to end. But how does this help us identify the murderer? Inspector Gregson interjected with growing impatience. We have multiple suspects, multiple opportunities, but no clear evidence pointing to any particular individual. On the contrary, Inspector, we have very clear evidence if only we arrange it properly. Consider the locked room. Everyone has focused on how the poison was administered, but no one has asked the more fundamental question, why was the room locked at all? Because Lord Asherton desired privacy, Lady Asherton said. It was his custom when working on sensitive matters. Indeed, it was his custom when he initiated the locking. But on this occasion, it was Miss Blackwood who locked the door from the outside at Lord Asherton's request. Why would he request such a thing? He could have locked it himself from the inside once she departed. Yet he specifically asked her to lock it, and even to test that it was secure. Why? The room fell silent as we all contemplated this question. It was Constance Blackwood who ventured an answer, her voice hesitant. Perhaps he knew someone might try to enter, someone he wished to keep out. Precisely. Holmes's eyes lit with approval. Lord Asherton was expecting trouble. He had decided to end the blackmail, to confront his tormentor. He took precautions to ensure he could not be disturbed during what he anticipated would be a difficult evening. But here we encounter our central paradox. If the room was locked to keep someone out, how did that person nonetheless succeed in poisoning him? The tea, I suggested. The poison must have been in the tea Miss Blackwood prepared. An obvious conclusion, Watson, and one that Inspector Gregson has already reached. But consider the timing. Miss Blackwood prepared and delivered the tea at 7 o'clock. Lord Asherton died sometime between 7:30 and 8:30, based on the medical examiner's assessment and the discovery of the body at 9. Sarconite acts relatively quickly, 20 to 30 minutes for a fatal dose. This suggests Lord Asherton drank the poisoned tea shortly before his death, not immediately upon receiving it. What difference does that make? Gregson demanded. All the difference in the world, Inspector. It means that Lord Asherton allowed the tea to sit on his desk for perhaps 30 minutes or more before consuming it. Why would he do that? The tea would have grown cold, unpalatable. Unless, Holmes paused dramatically, unless he was waiting for something or someone. Unless the tea was not poisoned when Miss Blackwood delivered it, but was poisoned afterward. But that's impossible, Gregson protested. The door was locked. No one could have entered. Could they not? Holmes moved to the window and drew aside the curtain, gazing out at the grey afternoon. Let me propose a theory, Inspector. Suppose Lord Asherton received a message, a note perhaps instructing him to lock his door and wait. The blackmailer, knowing Lord Asherton had decided to expose them, had decided to strike first. The message might have warned of danger from another quarter, or promised a final meeting to resolve matters. Lord Asherton, believing himself safe behind a locked door, complied. But how could the blackmailer poison the tea if they couldn't enter the room? I asked. Holmes turned back to face us, and I saw in his expression that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and regret that always accompanied the solving of a particularly clever crime. Because, my dear Watson, they did not need to enter the room. They needed only to introduce the poison through some means that did not require physical presence. And I believe I know how it was accomplished. He crossed to where Carruthers stood and addressed the butler directly. You mentioned that a fire was burning in Lord Asherton's study that evening. Was it your habit to tend that fire during the evening? Yes, sir. I would typically add coal at 8 o'clock to ensure it remained warm through the evening hours. But on Monday evening, you did not perform this duty because Lord Asherton was found dead before 8 o'clock arrived. That is correct, sir, and the fire would have been burning steadily from 6 o'clock, when you first lit it, until at least 9 o'clock when the body was discovered. 3 hours during which the chimney provided a direct connection between Lord Asherton's study and the outside air. Holmes's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, or more precisely, a connection between the study and anything placed within the chimney itself. The implication struck me with the force of revelation. Good heavens, Holmes! You mean the poison was introduced through the chimney? Not directly through the chimney, but through a clever application of heat and chemistry. Certain forms of aconite, when properly prepared, can be volatilized, turned into vapor, by sustained heat. If a container of such prepared poison were placed in the chimney above the fire, the heat would gradually vaporize its contents, releasing toxic fumes into the room. Lord Asherton, breathing these fumes over the course of 30 minutes or more, would have absorbed a fatal dose without ever realizing he was being poisoned. The symptoms would have come on gradually: numbness, dizziness, cardiac distress. By the time he understood something was wrong, he would have been too weak to call for help. Lady Asherton had gone deathly pale. That's monstrous. Who could devise such a thing? Someone with knowledge of chemistry and access to the necessary materials, Holmes replied. Someone who could move about the property without attracting suspicion. Someone who could climb onto the roof and drop a prepared container down the chimney at the appropriate time. He fixed his gaze on Geoffrey Asherton, someone, perhaps, who was seen in an agitated state near the back stairs at E. 7:30, the very time when such a deed might have been accomplished by accessing the roof through the attic stairs at the back of the house. Geoffrey's face had gone from flush to ashen. This is madness. You're constructing an elaborate fantasy based on conjecture, and I am constructing a theory based on evidence and logic, Holmes interrupted. Evidence that can be verified. Inspector Gregson, I suggest your men examine the chimney of Lord Asherton's study. I believe they will find residue of a container that was placed there and subsequently consumed by the heat. I also suggest examining the roof access and the chimney top for signs of recent disturbance. If my theory is correct, such evidence will be unmistakable. Gregson nodded grimly. I'll send men immediately. But Mr. Holmes, even if we find such evidence, it does not necessarily point to Mr. Geoffrey. Anyone could have accessed that roof. True. But not everyone had the motive, means, and opportunity that converge so neatly in Mr. Asherton's case. Consider, he possessed the botanical and chemical knowledge to prepare the poison. He had free access to his mother's garden. He was experiencing severe financial pressure that his father's death would relieve. He was seen in a suspicious location at the critical time. And most damningly, Holmes withdrew a small notebook from his pocket. He has made several significant purchases in recent weeks that far exceed his stated allowance. Geoffrey Asherton leaped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. Are you suggesting that I poisoned my own father? I was nowhere near his study that evening. The door was locked, as has been established beyond doubt. Please sit down, Mr. Asherton, Holmes said calmly, his tone unruffled by the outburst. I am merely establishing the movements of all parties during the relevant period. You were near the pantry at approximately the time Miss Blackwood was preparing the tea. That is a fact, not an accusation. What I find curious, continued Holmes, is that you did not mention this walk when first questioned. Why the omission? Geoffrey sank back into his chair, defiance giving way to something close to despair. I did not think it relevant. I was upset, as I often was after arguments with my father. I walked the corridors to calm myself. I saw no one, spoke to no one. What significance could such a walk possibly have? Perhaps none, Holmes conceded. Or perhaps a great deal, depending on what you observed during this walk. Did you see Miss Blackwood in the pantry? I may have glimpsed someone, but I paid no attention. My mind was occupied with my own troubles. And did you pass near your father's study? I passed the corridor that leads to it, yes. But the door was closed, and I heard nothing from within. Holmes paced slowly before the fireplace, fingers steepled in thought. We have several facts. The poison came from monkshood in Lady Asherton's garden. Someone knowledgeable in botany and chemistry extracted it. The tea was prepared in a pantry accessible to all. Lord Asherton was killed in a locked room with no apparent entry after the door was secured. And the Lord was being blackmailed about some secret he intended to end. He turned to face the room. They did not need to enter the room. They introduced the poison through means that required no physical presence. He fixed his gaze on Geoffrey. You were seen near the back stairs at 7:30, when the poison might have been introduced through the chimney via volatilized aconite vapor, released by heat from the study's fire. Geoffrey's face drained of color. This is madness, an elaborate fantasy based on conjecture. I am constructing a theory based on evidence and logic, retorted Holmes. The chimney provides a path for the toxin to enter the study air without physical intrusion. Inspector Gregson checked the chimney for residue and signs of recent disturbance. Gregson nodded, somewhat reluctant but compelled. Holmes continued. The tea was likely not poisoned when Miss Blackwood brought it at 7 o'clock, but afterward. Lord Asherton may have been instructed to lock the door and wait, believing himself safe. The room was silent at this revelation. Lady Asherton's composure faltered, her face pale. Holmes turned to her. You maintain the monkshood in your garden. Your knowledge and access to chemicals suggest motive, but also opportunity extends to others in the house. He looked at Geoffrey again. Your knowledge of botany and chemistry, combined with financial pressure and suspicious movements, places you at the scene in a critical window. Geoffrey protested, but Holmes remained unshaken. Holmes's thoughts lingered on the blackmailer mentioned in Lord Asherton's diary. Who profited from silencing Lord Asherton? And how did the blackmailer fit into this household's web? The answer now rested in the chimney's secrets, the recently disturbed earth in the herb garden, and the diary's cryptic notes. Holmes was certain the final piece would soon fall into place. The weight of Holmes's words hung heavy in the room, punctuated only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Geoffrey Asherton sat rigid, clenched fists resting on his knees, his face a mask of disbelief and barely contained fury. This is preposterous, he finally spat. All these supposed facts and insinuations with no proof. You accuse me of murder with a concoction of speculation and circumstantial evidence. Holmes took a deliberate step forward, his gaze unflinching. Mr. Asherton, I am not here to cast judgment. I am here to uncover truth. Your presence near the back stairs at precisely the time I suspect the poison was introduced, via the chimney, is significant. Moreover, your knowledge of botany and chemistry puts you in a position few others in this household hold. Geoffrey drew a sharp breath, but Holmes continued undeterred. And yet your movements during that time were concealed. Your valet initially claimed ignorance of your whereabouts before 7:30, then admitted you were agitated near the pantry corridor, a location dangerously proximate to the route needed to access the roof and chimney. Inspector Gregson leaned forward, voice urging caution yet edged with suspicion. The roof access is through a narrow attic stairway, little known outside the household inner circle. Who else could have used it? Holmes's eyes glinted. Precisely why it narrows our suspect list. The butler, the housekeeper, Lady Asherton, Miss Blackwood, and Geoffrey Asherton are among the few with access. But each carries a different motive and opportunity, complexities we must untangle. He turned to Carruthers, the butler. Have you noted any unusual activity on the roof or chimney recently? The butler nodded. Just 3 nights ago I noticed footprints on the roof, quite large and unfamiliar. I suspected the gardener but dismissed it as likely a prank or oversight. Holmes smiled thinly. Unusual indeed. Now, Inspector, I trust your men will find evidence of the container that released the poison. But this does not yet prove guilt. It only confirms the method. He paused, surveying the gathered faces. What intrigues me so, what I consider the crux, is the blackmail and the secret that Lord Asherton guarded so zealously. The poison was only a symptom of a deeper malady, a family fissure exposed. Lady Asherton's eyes narrowed sharply, voice brittle but firm. I see little point in dragging old secrets into spotlight. My late husband's affairs are mine to bear, not to be dissected by strangers. Holmes's gaze softened yet remained incisive. But a secret kept under threat of exposure can drive one to desperate acts of protection or of destruction. Tell me, Lady Asherton, Was your relationship with Lord Asherton entirely without strain beyond his erratic investments and proposed remarriage? Her composure faltered just a moment. We had our differences. No marriages without them after 2 decades. But I was loyal until his last breath, Constance Blackwood offered quietly. There are things beneath the surface most do not see. My discovery of the diary revealed till now hidden torment that clouded Lord Asherton's final days. Holmes nodded appreciatively. And I believe the secret touched someone still present among us, someone willing to kill rather than see it revealed. The blackmailer was desperate, the poison clever. He turned his attention resolutely to Geoffrey Asherton. You admitted knowledge but denied practical experience, yet recent purchases suggest otherwise. Can you explain these transactions? Geoffrey swallowed hard, his earlier bluster replaced by nervousness. I cannot. These purchases were personal, not related to my father. Your truth will emerge, Holmes said softly. But for now I keep my judgment reserved. We wait for the forensic reports. The room seemed to deflate slightly, tension easing as if the investigation momentarily suspended its accusatory momentum. Holmes finally walked to the window, gazing out at the gathering dusk over Elm Street. The poison was introduced through subterfuge and cunning. The motive lies in secrets kept too long and fears too great to confront openly. Turning back, he addressed the assembly with quiet authority. Tonight I shall review all evidence once more. Tomorrow will bring a decisive move, prepared or unprepared. The murderer will be revealed. As the household dispersed, each lost in their tangled thoughts, Holmes's mind raced through the puzzle pieces, eager to arrange them into a picture of truth and justice. The game, as ever, was afoot. The gathering room fell into a tense silence as Holmes's words echoed through the chamber. Geoffrey Asherton's storm of anger had calmed, yet the storm within him was evidently far from over. Lady Asherton, still pale beneath her widow's veil, stared at Holmes with a guarded intensity that bespoke her own growing unease. Holmes, however, was unperturbed by the charged atmosphere. Slowly he turned his gaze toward Inspector Gregson. You spoke of plans to investigate the chimney, Inspector. I trust your men have been most thorough in their search for any evidence? Gregson nodded. We found traces of a small scorched metallic container, wedged just out of easy reach near the top of the chimney. It appears to have contained a volatile substance. Holmes inclined his head, as if confirming his theory more concretely. Excellent. The container's presence confirms the possibility of volatilized poison introduced via the chimney. This clever method would allow the toxin to enter the study's atmosphere without any need for physical entry. Holmes turned back to the family, locking eyes first with Geoffrey. You were seen near the back stairs around 7:30, a mere stone's throw from the pantry where the tea was prepared. You claim you were agitated, walking to clear your mind. Yet you did not mention your presence here when first questioned. Geoffrey's expression darkened. I was upset. Walking helped me think. It was of no consequence to anyone. But to the investigation, Holmes pressed, your walk is crucial. It placed you near the possible route for introducing the poison. Lady Asherton scoffed quietly, but Holmes continued, however, the conspiracy does not end with physical presence. The motive, the means, and the knowledge required to prepare such a concentrated and volatile poison remain central. Geoffrey, your studies at Cambridge included natural sciences. You have academic knowledge of botany and chemistry, sufficient to extract and concentrate such toxins. He paused, letting that thought settle before continuing. Financial disputes between you and your father intensify the potential motive. Geoffrey stood firm. I may have had motives, but not the heart to commit murder. Holmes smiled faintly. Motive and opportunity are the starting points of investigation, not the conclusion. He then shifted his attention to Lady Asherton. Madam, the herb garden you tend so diligently contains the very aconite from which the poison was derived. Traces of recent harvesting were found, and a tincture with the label removed was discovered in the garden shed. I did not prepare any poison, she declared with sharp dignity. The plant is ornamental, Holmes raised a hand. Of course. Though this plant is deadly in the wrong hands, that does not imply guilt or innocence alone. But it further supports that the poison's source was household and accessible to few. Holmes finally addressed the assembled group as a whole. We must consider why Lord Asherton requested Miss Blackwood to lock the study door behind her. He sought solitude, yes, but also protection, expecting someone to attempt entry. Turning toward Constance Blackwood, Holmes spoke kindly but firmly. "Miss Blackwood, you prepared and brought the tea at 7 o'clock. You locked the door and heard the bolt slide home. Yet the poison was likely not present then." Constance's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That is correct. I did not poison the tea." Holmes nodded and looked to Inspector Gregson. "The evidence suggests the poison was introduced shortly after the tea's delivery by other means, namely, the volatilized toxin released via chimney." He glanced at Geoffrey. "You or someone with similar knowledge and access had the opportunity to place the container. The key now was the blackmail." Holmes unfolded the diary once more, flicking to the entries where Lord Asherton wrote of his torment. This the motive. Someone desperate to protect a secret, willing to strike even at close quarters. Lady Asherton's composure cracked. "What secret? What secret do you accuse me of keeping?" Holmes's reply was deliberate. "I accuse no one at this juncture, but I observe that the blackmailer must have intimate knowledge of the household and of Lord Asherton's passions, knowledge that narrows the field considerably." "Who else?" Geoffrey's voice was sharp with impatience. "Consider the servants," Holmes said, nodding slightly toward Carruthers and Mrs. Aldridge. "Knowledge of schedules, keys, access points. Who could have moved unseen, undetected? And who had cause to act?" Inspector Gregson's skeptical tone returned. "This is conjecture, Holmes. We must have evidence," Holmes smiled thinly. "Evidence lies in the patterns, the footprints in the garden near the window, the disturbance of the soil beneath, the visitor who left no name." Holmes glanced toward the window overlooking the garden. "The answer lies beneath the surface, in footsteps both literal and figurative." He fixed Geoffrey once more with a piercing gaze. "Your walk to clear your head may have been more than it seemed, and your actions in recent weeks, the purchases beyond your allowance, suggest preparation." Geoffrey's defiance faltered. Holmes concluded, "The stage is set. The players reveal themselves with every movement and word. The final act is near." The room seemed to hold its breath, as Holmes's eyes gleamed with the thrill of an impending revelation. The case, complex and tangled, was drawing inexorably toward its conclusion. The evening wore on, the oppressive air of tension giving way to contemplative silence as each member of the household retired. Burdened with thoughts of deceit and betrayal, Holmes, accompanied by Watson and Inspector Gregson, made his way to the dimly lit study. The room, rich with leather-bound volumes and dark wood, felt heavier now, a silent witness to the day's revelations. Holmes moved toward the fireplace, eyes narrowing as he inspected the hearth closely. The container found in the chimney, subtly designed to release poison when heated, he mused aloud. Ingeniously concealed, yet flawed in its execution, the culprit underestimated the diligence of our investigation. Watson, ever the observer, noted the faintest trace of soot on the mantelpiece. "You think this was an intentional oversight, Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Every perpetrator leaves a signature, Watson, whether by design or accident. This soot marks the precise moment the poison was activated." He turned, eyes shining with renewed conviction. "The poison's source, Monkshood, was accessible only through the garden. Disturbed soil near the western border suggests recent activity, perhaps the nocturnal harvest of the lethal plant." Gregson nodded, his expression grave. "Our men have found glove fragments near the garden gate. They are being analyzed." Holmes paused, then said, "And gloves, Watson, speak volumes. They indicate someone conscious of leaving no fingerprints, a calculated, cold caution." Turning to Watson, Holmes confided, "The blackmail remains the mystery's core. The diary entries reveal that Lord Asherton feared exposure of his past, something close to his heart, something that could ruin his family's reputation. Have we discovered anything, then, about this secret?" Watson inquired. Holmes hesitated briefly, then said, "Evidence points toward an illegitimate child, one hidden to protect the Asherton name, mentioned cryptically in the diary." "And who might this child be?" Gregson asked sharply. Holmes's gaze swept the room. "It could be one of us, hidden beneath layers of social expectation and silence." Gregson's eyes flicked toward Geoffrey Asherton. This young man had the most to lose, especially with his father's recent plans to alter the estate's inheritance. Holmes nodded. Yes, but also Lady Asherton's demeanour suggests she knows far more than she admits. Her sudden paleness when the secret arose was telling. Before deeper accusations could arise, Holmes's voice cut sharply. We must act before the murderer strikes again or manipulates the evidence further. He spoke quietly to Gregson. A watch must be kept on all household members. Discreet surveillance at all hours. As the night deepened, Holmes and Watson retired to their quarters. Watson observed in silence the determined set of Holmes's jaw, the investigator's mind racing far ahead, piecing together fragmentary truths. The dawn would bring new interrogation and revelations. But one truth was certain: the tangled web of deception was beginning to unravel, and the murderer's carefully constructed facade was cracking beneath the weight of Holmes's relentless scrutiny. At first light, the atmosphere in the Asherton estate was thick with guarded anticipation. Holmes and Watson convened with Inspector Gregson in the breakfast room, where carefully arranged trays of tea and marmalade were virtually untouched, as the household's focus remained on the unfolding investigations. Holmes studied the list of surveillance notes Gregson had compiled overnight. The watch has revealed much more than I anticipated, Holmes remarked, scanning the report. Multiple furtive movements to and from the garden occurred past midnight. Gloves were worn consistently, indicating awareness of the need to avoid detection, Gregson added grimly. But more alarming was the whispered argument between Lady Asherton and Miss Blackwood at the servants' quarters. It speaks to fractures within the household that may be as poisonous as the monkshood itself. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, secrets breed secrets. We must tread carefully. As the morning progressed, Holmes requested private interviews, starting with Lady Asherton. In the quiet of the drawing room, where the morning sun filtered softly through lace curtains, Holmes's approach was both direct and empathetic. Lady Asherton, I wish to understand your perspective on your late husband's recent distress. His diary hints at a secret tied to a child. Is this true? And to what extent does it concern you? The lady's composure was brittle, tempering her pain with steely resolve. Yes, there was a child, but not mine nor my husband's by lawful right, she admitted, voice low but unwavering. The secret that could have shattered our family's reputation had it come to light in the wrong manner. Holmes leaned forward. Who guarded this secret? She paused, eyes reflecting decades of sorrow. My husband, his sister, and myself. But the child was hidden away, raised elsewhere for his protection and our shame. Do you know where this child might be now? Watson ventured. Lady Asherton shook her head. No. He was taken from us many years ago during turbulent times. Holmes pressed on. Did your husband's blackmailer threaten to reveal this child's existence? With a slight bitter nod, Lady Asherton replied, Yes, that is why he was so desperate in his final days. Holmes concluded the conversation with a sense of solemn respect. Thank you, Lady Asherton. Your courage in facing these truths aids us greatly. Shortly after, Holmes interviewed Geoffrey Asherton. The young man's arrogance showed signs of cracking as Holmes's interrogation pressed deeper. Geoffrey, your recent purchases included chemicals and equipment consistent with poison preparation. Can you account for them? Geoffrey's defenses crumbled slightly. I bought them for a botanical experiment. Nothing more. Holmes was not convinced, but allowed the explanation to stand for the moment. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, brought Holmes a small, ornate locket found in the garden near the disturbed soil. Inside was a faded photograph of a boy resembling Geoffrey, yet clearly younger. Holmes's eyes lit with discovery. Watson, this locket may be the key to revealing the hidden child. The resemblance is uncanny. Then Geoffrey himself may be the child in question, Watson said slowly. Holmes nodded. If so, his motive and desperation over inheritance issues take on a different shade. It is not mere greed, but a fight for identity and survival. Before Holmes could delve further, a sudden commotion erupted from the hallway. Inspector Gregson hurried in, pale and breathless. Holmes, someone has been tampering with the evidence, he exclaimed. The container from the chimney which we secured has disappeared. Holmes's expression hardened. This confirms my suspicion. The murderer is still among us, watching, manipulating. He turned sharply. We must act quickly. Guards posted. Searches intensified. The truth will out. As the household convulsed with wariness, Holmes's mind raced to piece together the final threads of this tangled web. The murderer's desperation was their undoing, but only careful deduction could uncover which of the present faces hid behind a mask of innocence. Holmes's mind sharpened with renewed intensity as the news of the missing poison container rippled through the household like a shockwave. The calculated boldness of the act bespoke a culprit running dangerously close to exposure, yet still desperate to manipulate the narrative to their advantage. The game was arriving at its climactic stages, where a single misstep could unravel years of guarded deceit. Without hesitation, Holmes ordered the home to be sealed, allowing no one to leave or enter the premises without his knowledge. "The murderer remains within these walls among us, cloaked in shadows," Holmes declared. "Inspector Gregson, every servant and family member is now both suspect and sentinel. Double the watch. Search every nook and cranny, for the missing container may yet be found." The household, already strained by grief and suspicion, grew tense as accusations simmered beneath polite facades. Holmes convened a private meeting with Watson near the hearth. "Watson, the removal of the container was an act of desperation. Time is of the essence and calm minds must prevail." Watson nodded, his ever-faithful gaze steady. "We must anticipate every move. But who amongst them would take such a reckless risk?" Holmes tapped the locket in his hand, its faded photograph still vivid in his thoughts. The locket connects Jeffrey to the hidden child, a secret that reframes the entire investigation. If Jeffrey is both son and suspect, then his motives blend legacy with revenge. His eyes narrowed. But desperation breeds recklessness. It is only a matter of moments before the murderer slips. Turning his focus back to the household, Holmes resumed his methodical inquiry, revisiting each suspect with renewed scrutiny. Lady Asherton, ever guarded, her grief deepened but still shrouded in silence, admitted to no knowledge of the locket or the child's whereabouts beyond what was revealed. Her demeanor, though fragile, held the steely veneer of a woman protecting the fragile remnants of her family's loyalty had been unwavering, revealed a tension hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. "I once overheard a late-night meeting between Lord Asherton and a stranger," she confided, voice lowered. "They spoke in hushed tones about fears for the future, secrets that could destroy them all." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "This stranger, Miss Blackwood, could well be the blackmailer who preyed on Asherton's fears." "I believe so," she replied. But no one else heard the conversation. Holmes exhaled slowly, thoughts weaving complex patterns. The blackmailer's presence within or near the household is undeniable, but their identity remains elusive. The butler Carruthers and housekeeper Mrs. Aldridge, always present but on the periphery, became increasingly conspicuous under Holmes's intermittent glances. Their intimate knowledge of household comings and goings painted them as both witnesses and potential players. Both were questioned anew, their pasts subtly probed, but yielding no immediate revelations. As night fell, Holmes and Watson revisited the garden, where disturbed earth and faint traces hinted at recent clandestine activity. Holmes's fingers traced the soil's subtle unevenness, eyes gleaming with insight. "Here, Watson, lies the physical link to the poison's source, a grave of secrets beneath the surface." Suddenly, a faint glint among the pebbles caught Holmes's eye. Bending, he uncovered a small crumpled piece of paper, forgotten or discarded in haste. It bore hurried handwriting. "The truth lies in the past, buried deeper than the roots of the Asherton tree." Holmes frowned. "A message or a warning? Someone within the house is trying to communicate or intimidate." Returning indoors, Holmes called the household together, his voice resolute. "The murderer is among us, desperate and aware that their carefully built facade is cracking. It is only a matter of time before their guilt becomes visible." His eyes fixed on Jeffrey Asherton. "You stand at the heart of this storm. Your secret, your motives, your actions all intertwined in this deadly tale." Jeffrey's face paled, lips pressed tight, while Lady Asherton's controlled exterior finally showed cracks of fear. Holmes's voice softened but remained firm. "No one here will escape the consequences of hidden truths and unspoken sins. But justice will prevail." As the household braced itself for what was to come, Holmes retreated to his room with Watson, mind fired with determination. The final act awaited, and every step taken now was toward a confrontation that would expose the darkness hiding beneath the Asherton estate's stately facade. The truth was near, and the game was indeed afoot. The tension in the Asherton estate reached a fevered pitch as Holmes and Watson spent the early hours in careful reflection, piecing together the fragments of a dark family secret laced with betrayal and greed. Holmes's keen mind labored tirelessly, retracing the steps and motives that had brought the household to the brink of disaster. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the locket, the faded photograph within still haunting the room's silence. "This locket," he mused quietly, "holds the key to the identity the family has long sought to bury." Geoffrey was raised in the shadow of secrets, perhaps unaware of the true weight he bears. Watson nodded thoughtfully. If Geoffrey is the hidden child, it complicates his motives considerably. For him, this is more than inheritance. It is vindication. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the sprawling grounds as the household roused itself. Holmes's morning inquiries were meticulous, retracing the footsteps and alibis with renewed scrutiny. Yet despite the intensifying investigation, the murderer remained elusive, a phantom cloaked in fear and desperation. An unexpected breakthrough came when Inspector Gregson's men uncovered a hidden compartment within the study's antique desk. Inside lay a bundle of letters, carefully concealed but revealing a venomous correspondence between Lord Asherton and the blackmailer. The letters spoke not only of threats, but of payments withheld, of secrets bartered for silence, and of a desperate plea for mercy. Holmes's eyes sparkled with the thrill of discovery. Here lies the motive writ in black ink. The blackmailer sought fortune and power, yet the promised sum was never paid in full. Watson glanced over the letters, noting the subtle references to a long-lost heir, financial ruin, and impending exposure. These letters deepen the tragedy and widen the circle of suspicion. Holmes's thoughts aligned with the evidence. Indeed, the blackmailer's identity remains concealed, but motives and opportunity narrow the field. The renewed investigation returned Holmes once more to Geoffrey Asherton. Confronted with the letters, Geoffrey's composure faltered. "I knew of these letters only recently," he confessed. "My father was burdened by them, but I never imagined they would lead to this." Holmes's gaze was steady. "You realize, Geoffrey, that knowing and hiding are vastly different things. Your actions must now speak with honesty if justice is to be served." Meanwhile, Mrs. Aldridge revealed a startling observation. One of the servants, typically quiet and unnoticed, had been acting strangely since the night of the murder, slipping away unnoticed at odd hours. Holmes's suspicions deepened. Suspicious behavior among the less obvious players often harbors the clearest truths. The complexity of intertwined motives, greed, and old wounds painted a vivid, if grim, picture. Holmes deduced that the blackmail and murder were not isolated acts, but responses to cascading desperation. As the sun dipped low once again, Holmes assembled the household. Tonight, the truth will emerge in the revealing light of justice. The veil is lifting and the murderer's mask will fall. Their eyes all turned toward Holmes, a mixture of fear, defiance, and anticipation filling the room. With careful deliberation, Holmes paced the floor, every instinct pointing toward the final confrontation, the moment when shadow would yield to substance, and the tangled web of deceit would be torn apart by the sword of truth. The game was on the brink of its conclusion, with only one move left to be made. The drawing room of the Asherton estate was hushed. Every occupant gathered in a palpable silence, awaiting the moment Sherlock Holmes would unravel the tangled web of deceit. Holmes stood with his sharp gaze sweeping the room, resting momentarily on each face, his presence commanding attention. The time had come to reveal the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, voice calm yet resolute, "we are confronted with a case that is as much about concealed identities as it is about murder. Yet through careful observation and deduction, every secret may be brought to light." He turned first to Geoffrey Asherton. "You are, in truth, the child long hidden beneath the surface of this family's history. The locket discovered in the garden and the resemblance it bore were no coincidence. Lord Asherton's secret was your birth, one he sought to conceal to protect a fragile reputation." Geoffrey's face paled, the weight of Holmes's words pressing heavily. "I never sought to harm my father," he whispered. "But the letters, those threats, the blackmail, pushed events beyond control." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, your father was tormented by a blackmailer, threatening to expose you and the family secret. The bundle of letters discovered in the hidden desk compartment provided the motive. Your funds, the suspicious nocturnal movements, and the glove fragments uncovered near the garden all converge to implicate you. He paced slowly, weaving his narrative. The poisoning was achieved ingeniously through the chimney, the volatile toxin released from a cleverly concealed container that could be ignited by the fire. You used your knowledge of botany and chemistry, evidenced by your recent purchases, to prepare the concentrated aconite poison derived from the monkshood growing in Lady Asherton's garden. Geoffrey's eyes fell to the floor. I did not intend murder, only to protect myself, to stop the blackmailer. But the plan spiraled beyond my control, Holmes continued. The removal of the container from the chimney was a desperate attempt to conceal your guilt once the investigation closed in. Yet in haste you left other clues behind. The disturbed soil, the hurried note found amongst the garden stones, and your absence during the crucial hour. He turned to Lady Asherton. You, madam, bore your own burdens but were innocent of this crime. Your knowledge of the secret child in the blackmail made you vigilant, but not culpable. Holmes's gaze swept the room, then returned to Geoffrey with steady authority. Justice must be served, but your confession clarifies the truth and spares the innocent. Geoffrey bowed his head. I accept my fate. Holmes then addressed the gathering. This case illuminates the dangers of secrets kept in darkness, the destructive power of fear and desperation. Yet it also reveals the inexorable force of truth when pursued with patience and logic. Turning to Watson, Holmes added quietly, and so ends another chapter in the annals of justice, with every piece aligned and every shadow dispelled. The room exhaled collectively, the tension palpable, but now replaced with a somber relief. The case of Lord Asherton's death was closed, a masterpiece of deduction, a testament to Holmes's enduring brilliance. As the household began to settle, Holmes and Watson retreated to the quiet of 221B Baker Street. Lighting his pipe, Holmes mused, "The essence of detective work, Watson, lies in the observation of the smallest details and the patient assembling of clues. Every puzzle, no matter how complex, yields to reason." Watson smiled. "And every mystery solved adds another layer to the legend of Sherlock Holmes." Holmes reclined, eyes half closed but ever sharp. "Indeed, my dear friend, the game, as always, remains afoot." Thus concluded the case of The Secrets of Elm Street, a tale of hidden lineage, desperate acts, and the triumph of truth through relentless deduction.